Welcome to your Optimal Personal Economy podcast with Justin Bennett. Your personal economy is your ability to create, protect, preserve, and utilize your wealth, your financial world. Justin will share strategies and stories to help you optimize your personal economy. Now, on to the show with Justin Bennett and co-host Matt Halloran.
Hello, and welcome to another podcast with Justin Bennett. Today, Justin is going to talk about the transfer of risk, which is a foundational philosophy and kind of business idea when it comes to insurance. But I don't personally think that it's talked about enough. And as Justin has spent so many years doing a lot more planning, this is really something that I think would be very interesting in seeing how he explains it. So, Justin, would you like to talk to us today about the transfer of risk?
Happy to do so, Matt. I think transfer of risk certainly applies to insurance, as you mentioned. I think transfer of risk also applies to investments, quite frankly. And we'll expand. I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. But I think, as I always like to do in an effort to provide proper context, I would say the opposite of transferring risk is simply assuming risk, right? So there's ultimately two options here on the table. It's either going to be to transfer risk or assume risk. And when we oftentimes have this discussion with clients, it's a very, very situational conversation with each person that we're speaking with. But, it does come down to making a determination if the risk at hand is able to be managed more effectively or less effectively than the person or a third party, right? So that's kind of what it comes down to. So let me explain actually a conversation that I just had yesterday with a client, and formed a really good relationship with this client over the years, and we've done a fair amount of planning for him and his family. And so the conversation was centered around this idea that he's got about 8 more years of running hard in his craft, and his earnings are, call it, in the 7-figure range there, maybe ballpark $1 to $2 million, right? So he's worked his tail off up to this point, and plans on continuing to work his tail off for the remaining 8 years, and then he's gonna either completely dial it down or shut it off, right? And so the conversation was, okay, well, should I consider, right? Because he doesn't need anything, like any of our clients, they don't need something, but should I consider protecting and transferring the risk with some of these earnings over the next 8 years, over and above what he's already transferred, right? So he's transferred some of the income, earnings, risk. In other words, if his income were to stop, his earnings were to stop, he's already shifted some of the risk away from him. He has not shifted 100% of the risk that he's able to shift away from him. So there's a little bit of room if he wants to, or if he should. And so the conversation was like, okay, well, given everything going on in my planning, given my overall situation, does it make sense to lay out $3,700 a year to protect and transfer the risk associated with, call it $90,000 a year of earnings or income? And so, I think on the surface, the knee-jerk reaction, what a lot of traditional conversations and traditional planning tends to be is, looking at that decision in a vacuum. In other words, it doesn't take into consideration investable assets accumulated to date. It does not take into consideration real estate positions to date. It does not take into consideration, future growth on those. It doesn't take into consideration conversations around when and if the income should stop, whether it be year 1, year 2, year 5, year 8, right? So if we're talking about an 8-year period at which he's going to continue to earn, we have to, use hypothetical scenarios. It does not take into consideration what his burn rate is. If someone's income is very, very high, oftentimes it's just assumed that their burn rate is high. However, it's not always the case that their burn rate is super high. Some people are able to control their burn rate and control their behavior and their consumption, and are able to get to a point in life where they can, retire a lot sooner than others. So when we factored all of those other variables into his conversation and we modeled it out, it wasn't just us exchanging words. We actually had a visual to a model that we use with our clients oftentimes, but we were trying to make a determination. Does it make sense to transfer this additional risk to a third party, or is it comfortable to the client for him to assume the risk? And the conclusion was that he was comfortable with assuming the risk that we were discussing. And I think what tends to happen is this confusion that, oh, well, just because there's room to transfer that risk and he's eligible to transfer that risk, and traditionally speaking, everybody should transfer that risk, doesn't necessarily mean that this client should. And I didn't try to talk him into transferring it or assuming it. I came at the conversation from a very objective perspective and try to give him some good thinking around where he is currently, what life would look like in the event he did lose his income over the next X amount of years, whether it be 1, 3, 5, 7, 8. We looked at a whole bunch of different scenarios. We took into account his accumulated investments. We took into account his burn rate, as I mentioned. We took into account his real estate. So we took all this into account, and we provided, I think, valuable thinking that resulted in him making a determination that the outlay, the cost of the $3,700 a year relative to the annual protection of about $100,000 compared to not laying out the $3,700 and not getting that $100,000 of risk transferred, it just didn't make sense, or at least he wasn't comfortable taking on that additional. He was comfortable assuming the risk, right? So in line with our theme here, in line with our conversation, he was very, very comfortable assuming the risk. So I think, that's one example. And sometimes people may wrap their arms around this conversation of transferring risk versus assuming the risk best when there's a scenario or a conversation or a situation that's spelled out. So I wanted to share that. But I think, to my earlier point, this idea that transferring risk is not just insurance based, it's also investment based. Here's how I would kind of surmise that and not provide like a specific scenario. I think many of our listeners and many of the folks that we work with understand that we spend a lot of time with closely held business owners, entrepreneurs. And I think that, people run businesses for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons may be to generate a profit. And so there's this decision at the end of the year that if there's $1 in the form of a profit, where should that dollar go? What should happen with that profit? And I think that most business owners tend to want to take the vast majority, if not all, of that dollar in the form of the profit and reinvest it back into their own business, which is effectively them assuming the risk associated with that dollar increasing year over year going forward, right? So they're assuming the investment risk associated with that $1 by driving it back into their business. So, obviously another option would be to take a a portion, a fraction, a percentage of that dollar at the end of the year and deploy it into an outside investment. And in doing so, to an extent, they're transferring the risk of that dollar to a third party, with the idea that that third party is going to be able to manage that, risk and produce some reward, some return on that dollar that they would then benefit from. So I think there's that risk assume, risk transfer conversation inside of the investments as well. And then, of course, with the investment transfer of risk versus assume of risk conversation, there's also, when driving it back into the business clearly could grow and appreciate and kick off more profit the following year. There's also fundamentally an understanding that there's lack of liquidity in a closely held business. That doesn't make it good or bad. That's just the cold hard reality. So, so a business owner who reinvests a dollar in the form of profit back into their own business is willing to assume the risk associated with that dollar growing. They're also willing to assume the risk associated with the illiquidity of that dollar, right? The illiquidity of that dollar. So, whereas if in the other example, if they took that dollar or some percentage of that dollar that is in the form of the profit and put it into an outside investment, there might be full and open liquidity and accessibility to liquidating or using that dollar or that portion of that dollar for anything that they may want, whether it be for consumption or for a different investment. So there's different attributes that need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at this risk assume, risk transfer conversation. So, Matt, I think we've given our listeners, I've given our listeners some information to chew on as it relates to the risk transfer versus risk assume. And I think what they'll start to do is maybe realize how it applies to them in their world. And, for those that are wanting to have a conversation, we're happy to have a phone call or a in-person or a Skype or a FaceTime meeting, with the people that are familiar with us and we're familiar with them, whether it be because they know some of the clients that we're working with or we've known them for a number of years now. But we're happy to discuss this whole risk transfer versus risk assume conversation as it relates to their situation because it is highly, highly situational.
I love the fact that you not only talked about, risk, transfer risk when it came to insurance, and I like how you pivoted into investments too, because that's a conversation that I don't think enough people have. So Justin, thank you so much. That was super informational today.
Thanks, Matt.
If you have not subscribed to the podcast, click that subscribe now button below. That way, every time Justin comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And if you know anybody who needs to hear this conversation, please just very, very quickly click that share button. That'd be super awesome. That way you can help share the knowledge with your friends and family. So for everybody at Bennett Financial Group, this is Matt Halloran, and we'll see you on the other side of the mic very soon.
Justin Bennett is a registered representative of Park Avenues Securities, LLC, or PAS. OSJ 1150 Raritan Road, Suite 201, Cranford, New Jersey, 07016. Phone number 908-709-0020. Securities products are offered through PAS, member of FINRA SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America. New York, New York. PAS is an indirect wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Bennett Financial Group LLC is not an affiliate or a subsidiary of PAS or Guardian.